Hi, my name is Julia, and this is me. So, throughout the past semester, I have really felt that this text has prompted a lot of self reflection based on the concepts that it's introduced. And throughout the rest of this video, I'm just going to be elaborating on three main concepts that I've kind of distilled from the text and that I believe are most representative for what I've learned. So, the first theme I found is that I tend to rely on nonverbal communication a lot. Sometimes it'll even take the place of verbal communication for me. So this theme comes from the self-assessment in Chapter 6, where I scored a 52 on nonverbal behaviors, while the average for college-age women is 47. So sometimes I'll make crazy facial expressions, or I'm just really expressive and I smile a lot, or I talk with my hands. And I think I do that because growing up I had low self-esteem, and self-esteem is what informs our self-worth. So throughout elementary school I had a gap between my two front teeth, and I didn't think that I was super pretty. This made me really self-conscious of my physical appearance, and because of that, I think I crafted a way of communicating non-verbally so as to not draw a ton of attention to myself. And so now, having grown up and moved past the self-conscious component of my non-verbal communication, my weird facial expressions are here to stay, but now they're kind of just funny or charming. And I do think that it's interesting, however, how I initially let my perception of myself inform my habits of communication. So that just speaks to the power of our self-concept. Going forward, knowing this about my nonverbal communication, I'll be more mindful of the communication that I do, especially in professional environments. I can't go around making goofy faces to communicate meaning in a job setting. I will have to rely on better, more sophisticated tactics to do so. So the second theme that I've found is that upon completing the Chapter 7 and Chapter 5 personal assessments, is that gender roles have actually shaped how I communicate, even if it's subconsciously. So in Chapter 7, I found that I scored way below average in critical listening, a 9 out of an average of 18 to be exact. This is telling in that I don't want to criticize or challenge others. I feel that I'm fearful of coming off as too domineering or controlling as a woman, so I've overcompensated in the other direction. I do believe that the traditional gender role of a woman as being sweet and kind has informed how I communicate. This has also presented itself in the types of listening responses that I employ. This spectrum ranges from purely reflective to purely evaluative, silent listening to advising. One reason that I'm hesitant to give strongly evaluative responses is that because women who do so are sometimes seen as bossy or non-feminine. It is for that reason that I settle on the empathizing or supporting region of the spectrum, where I can give a reflective, supportive response, as well as a bit of advice and evaluation. Before reading this text, I did not understand the full extent to which I have allowed gender roles to box in how I communicate. Upon becoming aware of this, I will now actively seek to listen and communicate in the way that best fits the situation, rather than just catering to an antiquated set of gender roles. The Chapter 5 personal assessment builds on this and gives context for this trend, as I scored a neutral attitude towards sexist language. The aspect of the definition of sexist language that most applies here is that sexist language unnecessarily differentiates between males and females. I've never faced blatant sexism for being a woman, but I do, however, feel that there is an unnecessary distinction made in how I'm supposed to live and communicate in the world as a woman. I think it's interesting how language is a window into the mind of a person. The colloquial phrases we use, such as mankind, man-made, or even the connotative difference between mothered and fathered, which is a deep-seated view of the expected gender roles of men and women. After taking this personal assessment and reading about sexist language in the text, I now realize that sexism is much more subtle than I realized. It is the small, somewhat colloquial words of everyday speech that continue to perpetuate these gender roles. Now that I'm aware of what I was once blind to, I will attempt to use neutral terms instead of sex-specific ones, such as calling a fireman a firefighter, in my everyday life. Now the last thing I'm going to discuss is that I tend to minimize conflict and quickly allow for forgiveness. I believe conflict and forgiveness are tightly linked, which is why I will discuss them as a pair. I'll use the Chapter 12 and Chapter 9 assessments to highlight this theme. So first let's look at Chapter 12. The main conflict styles that I employ are avoidance and collaboration. For avoidance, I would say that I selectively ignore, as the textbook so eloquently puts it. I tend to avoid creating conflict when it's unnecessary. The danger with avoidance, however, is that it is a lose-lose strategy because it allows for the potential buildup of resentment. I would say that I use avoidance as my primary strategy Because when I was growing up, my father would criticize and correct everything, and so yet again, I have overcompensated in the other direction. In an attempt to avoid becoming like my father, I avoid conflict. I'm aware of the dangers of this strategy, however, so I'll strive not to let bitterness lie. If it is an issue of conflict that I cannot avoid, I will bring it up for discussion. Luckily for me, however, my second conflict strategy is collaboration, which is a win-win strategy. Once a conflict can no longer be avoided, I will seek to find a solution that works for everyone. I actively attempt to avoid making unilateral decisions and instead make a decision that benefits both people. One strategy that I will use is to open up a free dialogue in the relationship in order to understand the other person's perspective. We can then collaborate on how best to solve the conflict with each other's needs in mind. The last personal assessment comes from Chapter 9. This assessment shows that I have high levels of forgiveness across the entire spectrum, mainly minimizing the consequences of the transgression and benevolent forgiveness. I would say that I have high levels of forgiveness to further avoid creating conflict. Sometimes, however, the minimization of consequences may mask how I truly feel. This is also dangerous, as it could lead to festering bitterness. A trend that I am seeing here is that burying my emotions by avoiding conflict or minimizing transgressions is not a wise strategy for relational success. Going forward, I will strive towards relational maintenance, the strategy of openness. Openness means talking about the successes and difficulties in a relationship, and freely talking about your needs and concerns. In this way, I think I can become more in touch with my emotions and less at risk of developing bitterness. Overall, I am truly grateful for this text, as it has highlighted some serious areas of growth that I can work on. Moreover, it has provided explanations for certain reasons as to why I am the way I am. I hope that everyone else was able to find this text useful, and have a safe and fun winter break.